my daughter and did what he did with her.
Arrests have been made at this time. I don't anticipate any additional arrests being made in the near future. But again, this case is ongoing. This case is still being investigated. So we're still going to see what happens there. Again, we're just getting started.
And I look out my window and Kyle's walking down the yard to his car. I open my window. I yell out to him, "Kyle, where are you going?" He never answered me back.
She was safe in her crib, in a house full of people who loved her, and then she was gone. In the quiet hours of a March morning in Spencer, Indiana, a 15-month-old disappeared without a trace. No broken windows, no forced entry, just silence and an empty crib where she was last seen. The shock rippled through the town, because this wasn't some stranger sneaking in under cover of darkness. This was someone who knew the house, someone who had been there before, trusted, familiar, invited. This is a case involving a disappearance, but more than that, it's a case about how danger can hide behind familiarity, about the comfort of routine and how easily that comfort can be shattered when boundaries are blurred and trust is misplaced. It's a reminder that not all threats are obvious and not all homes are as safe as they seem. Before we begin, please note that this video discusses real events surrounding a disappearance. While we've taken every step to present it responsibly and without graphic content, some moments may be emotionally difficult. Viewer discretion is advised. To those joining us for the first time, welcome. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And to my dear returning viewers and friends, thank you. Your continued support through your shares, likes, and thoughtful comments helps keep these stories alive, meaningful, and raises a lot of awareness. We're truly grateful to have you here. Now, let's go back to a small Midwestern town, to a baby girl named Shaylin Ammerman, and to the night her family closed their eyes, unaware that everything would change before morning. March 23, 2016, Spencer, Indiana. A quiet town in Owen County where most mornings begin without incident. But that morning, the silence felt different. A 911 call was made. 15-month-old Shaylin Ammerman had been at home with her father and grandparents. She had gone to sleep as usual in the comfort of her crib, surrounded by family. By sunrise, she had vanished. There was no sound, no broken locks, no sign of entry or exit, only a still room and a crib that was no longer occupied. Shaylin's disappearance sent immediate waves of concern through the household. The family didn't hesitate. The 911 call was placed by her grandmother, Tamara Morgan, and local authorities responded within minutes. Inside the home were 6 adults who had each played a role in Shaylin's care. Her father, Justin Ammerman, her grandmother and primary caregiver, Tamara, her uncle, Adam, Tamara's husband, Danny Morgan, a housemate named Kelly Rogers, and Kyle Parker, a familiar face in the home and a friend of the family. Shaylin had last been seen the night before. Tamara had bathed her, prepared her bottle, and placed her in her crib shortly after 10 p.m. The evening had been uneventful. There were no reports of loud activity or any disruptions in the house. What made the situation so difficult to comprehend was how normal everything had seemed. Shaylin was a calm, joyful child, known for dancing anytime music played. She was often described as gentle, easy to care for, and always smiling. Her presence had brought peace to the household. Jessica Stewart, Shaylin's mother, had not been at the home that night, but she shared custody with Justin and remained closely involved in her daughter's life. Nothing about the family structure had raised concern. Shaylin was surrounded by people who cared for her and, by all outward appearances, was being raised in a stable environment. Police began their initial interviews that morning. Each adult was questioned, every door and window checked. Authorities looked for anything that might point to an explanation, but nothing added up. The house was intact. The backyard showed no signs of movement. Neighbors hadn't heard or seen anything out of place. The only indication that something had happened was that Shaylin was no longer there. Officers turned to timelines. Who had been in the house? Who had gone to bed and when? Tamara confirmed that Shaylin had been asleep before 10:30. The others had spent time watching movies. Kyle Parker, a guest that night, had remained behind after others went to sleep. By morning, Parker was gone. What had begun as a missing persons report quickly evolved. Authorities realized they weren't just searching for a child who had wandered off. The scene inside the house had been too quiet, too untouched, and the time frame too narrow. There was no panic in the hours before dawn, no cries for help, just the unsettling realization that someone had entered or never left and taken a child from her bed without leaving a single visible trace. The town of Spencer, close-knit and quiet, was shaken by the news as investigators worked to retrace every step from the night before. One question started to rise above the rest. If the front door had never been forced, who had used it? And how could someone so familiar with the household become part of something no one had seen coming? In the early hours of daylight, what lingered in the home wasn't just confusion. It was the slow unraveling of a truth no one had considered yet, that whatever had happened might have happened from the inside. As soon as the family realized Shaylin was gone, they made the call. It came in shortly after 9 a.m. Police arrived within minutes and immediately began coordinating the response. The home was quiet, too quiet. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs of struggle, no damage. The layout of the house remained untouched, except for the crib, which now sat empty. Officers began by gathering details. They interviewed everyone who had been inside the home the night before. From those conversations, a clear timeline started to form, and with it, a growing sense of urgency. By midday, the search had moved beyond the property. Law enforcement expanded the perimeter. Patrol cars moved out to surrounding streets. Officers knocked on doors and alerted neighbors. Community volunteers joined the effort. People from Spencer and nearby towns arrived to help. Some brought flashlights, others printed flyers, many simply wanted to look, because every moment mattered. Specialized teams were deployed. Canine units searched the area for any scent trail. The nearby White River became a focal point. Boats were launched. Sonar technology scanned beneath the surface. Crews searched both the water and the river bank. It was a full-scale operation, and the town was watching. By the end of the day, the case had made the news. Local networks were already reporting on the disappearance. Regional coverage picked it up next. Then national outlets began to follow the story. Within 24 hours, the search for Shaylin was no longer just a local concern. It was a developing case now seen by millions. But even as the outside world watched, investigators had already begun to focus inward. One name had come up again and again: Kyle Parker. He wasn't a stranger. He had been in the house that night. A friend of Shaylin's uncle, Adam Ammerman, Parker had visited the home many times before. The family knew him. He had shared meals there, spent time with them. He wasn't someone they feared. He was someone they trusted. That night, Parker had been among those watching movies in the living room. According to statements, drinks had been shared. The mood had been casual. One by one, the others went to bed. But Parker didn't. Witnesses reported that he was still awake after midnight. At some point between 3 and 4 a.m., Adam recalled hearing the front door open. He looked toward it briefly and believed he saw Parker leaving the house. He noticed something in Parker's arms, but couldn't confirm what it was. That detail would come up again during interviews, and it would raise serious concern. Investigators learned that Parker didn't go home after leaving. Instead, he went to a friend's residence and asked to use the shower. He also requested to have some of his clothes washed. The request seemed out of place, and the friend noted it when later contacted by law enforcement. Now the pieces were beginning to shift. Parker had opportunity, he had access, and he had left the house during the small window of time when Shaylin had gone missing. Still, there was no physical evidence, no clear signs, no direct statements that tied him to anything. But behavior can say a lot. Parker had not alerted anyone. He hadn't called. He hadn't expressed concern when the disappearance made headlines. He hadn't even come forward with a statement of support. He simply vanished from the center of the investigation. Until police brought him back in, he wasn't under arrest. But he was no longer just a guest. He was now a focus. Authorities began reviewing his history. Kyle Parker didn't have a significant criminal background. No open investigations, no pending complaints. But none of that mattered as much as what couldn't be explained. Why had he left in the middle of the night? Why had he asked to shower and wash his clothes at someone else's house? And why, after a child went missing, had he said nothing? As detectives began building their timeline, one conclusion started to emerge. Whatever happened that night hadn't come from outside the home. It had come from within. Before his name appeared in official reports, Kyle Parker was just another familiar face to the Ammerman family. He wasn't a stranger. He wasn't new. He was part of the background, quiet, unremarkable, and consistent. A friend of Adam Ammerman, Shaylin's uncle, Kyle had visited the home more than a dozen times over the previous months. He was someone they recognized, someone they welcomed. There was nothing about him that stood out. He didn't have a criminal past. He didn't cause conflict. By all accounts, he was mild-mannered, soft-spoken, sometimes reserved, but never hostile. And that's what made this part of the case so unsettling, not because he was threatening, but because he wasn't. On March 22nd, Kyle was invited over again, a casual evening. Movies, drinks, small talk. Most people in the house eventually went to bed. Kyle stayed up. That detail alone wasn't enough to cause alarm, but in the days that followed, investigators began to pay closer attention. Not because he had done something obvious, but because he hadn't. As the community launched search efforts and law enforcement intensified their focus, Parker stayed noticeably quiet. He didn't check in. He didn't assist. And when questioned, his answers were short and controlled. It wasn't just what he said, it was what he didn't. But what shifted things dramatically was a call from someone much closer to him. Kyle's stepfather, Mike Patton, reached out to police. He had a concern, something Kyle had said that wouldn't leave his mind. According to his report, Kyle had made an alarming comment. "They'll know once they find her." It wasn't direct, but it carried weight, enough that Mike felt compelled to come forward. That decision would help reshape the course of the investigation. Police followed up quickly. They began to take a deeper look into Kyle's personal life. Not just his actions that night, but his patterns, his tendencies, and how he interacted with those around him. What stood out was how little stood out. He hadn't drawn attention to himself before. He hadn't given any overt signs of risk. There were no complaints filed, no conflicts with the law. And yet, there was a growing sense among investigators that something about his behavior was being overlooked. He hadn't returned home that morning. He hadn't spoken publicly. And while the entire community rallied around the family, Kyle appeared absent. To the Ammermans, this was more than unsettling. This was someone they had let in, someone they had shared space with. He had been inside their living room. He knew the layout of the home. He had sat among them, listened, observed, and blended in. And it was that access, quiet, unnoticed, that now raised the most serious questions. Why had he stayed awake when others went to bed? Why had he said what he said? Why had someone who had always been considered harmless suddenly seemed so evasive? For law enforcement, the answers didn't come in outbursts or confessions. They came in behavior, in what was missing, in what had changed. This wasn't just about one person. It was about proximity, about how closeness can sometimes mask intent, and how trust, once given, can become the very thing that prevents suspicion. Kyle Parker hadn't broken into the Ammerman home. He had been invited. He wasn't hiding in the shadows. He was sitting at the table. And that realization would reframe everything that came next. Not just for investigators, but for the people who thought they knew him. As the investigation moved into its third day, the search had shifted. This was no longer an open-ended effort. It was now built on a timeline, a narrowed focus, and behavior that, piece by piece, was pointing toward one individual. Detectives conducted detailed interviews with every adult present in the Ammerman household the night Shailene was last seen. Each person was spoken to separately. Statements were cross-referenced, timelines checked for consistency. No one was excluded without confirmation. The process was methodical. The goal? Eliminate doubt. As more information surfaced, attention turned to Kyle Parker. Investigators obtained warrants to examine Parker's digital activity, his phone, location history, deleted content, and social media behavior. They weren't looking for one specific message, they were looking for patterns, and they found them. Gaps in data, inconsistent explanations, and most of all, a level of disengagement that stood out against the urgency everyone else was experiencing. To strengthen their assessment, investigators conducted polygraph tests. While not legally binding, these tests offered another tool in measuring truthfulness. Those who were in the home that night reportedly passed. Kyle Parker did not. With pressure mounting, Parker's tone shifted. During further questioning, he agreed to guide officers to a specific location, just outside Gossport, Indiana, roughly 10 miles from the Ammerman residence. The area was wooded, isolated, and bordered by the White River. It was there that the search came to an end, and the outcome confirmed what many had feared. The site was sealed off and documented by law enforcement. Forensic teams arrived to collect and catalog every possible clue. Markers were placed, photographs taken, samples gathered. The scene transitioned from an area of interest to a key part of the case. Among the items recovered were materials that had been exposed to heat or intentionally altered. Some pieces of clothing showed evidence of partial damage, which limited the success of forensic testing. But despite the condition of the materials, the findings added to a growing body of evidence that something critical had occurred there and had been concealed. The official medical assessment was led by Dr. Donna Stewart, who examined all available evidence. Although the full details were not made public, authorities later confirmed that her conclusions aligned with the direction the case had taken. Medical findings confirmed the nature of the incident and were consistent with the charges brought by prosecutors. Because some of the evidence had been compromised, investigators were unable to secure full DNA profiles that could link Parker directly to all aspects of the case. Still, his cooperation, movements, and behavior, along with his direct involvement in leading officers to that site, provided a foundation for arrest. On March 25th, 2 days after that discovery, Kyle Parker was taken into custody. He was charged with multiple serious offenses. While the absence of definitive forensic matches posed a challenge, the weight of the circumstantial evidence, paired with his conduct and digital record, was enough to move the case forward. This was not the result of a single breakthrough. It was the product of steady, focused work, a timeline built from conversations, a case strengthened by observation, and an outcome driven by persistence. Kyle Parker had blended in quietly. But now the silence was over. And with that, the case moved into the next phase, where facts would be tested, arguments made, and the justice system would begin its work. With the investigation concluded and Kyle Parker in custody, attention turned to the legal system. What came next was no longer about uncovering what happened, but determining how the justice process would respond to it. The prosecution reviewed every piece of evidence, from Parker's movements to witness testimony to the digital trail that had quietly documented his actions. The case was extensive, but not without challenges. There were gaps in the forensic evidence. Certain materials collected from the site had been compromised. Lab testing confirmed that damage to key items had limited what could be used in court. While the timeline, behavior, and Parker's own decisions had drawn a clear picture, the physical evidence needed to secure a trial conviction beyond any doubt was limited. Lead prosecutor Donald Vandermoor was faced with a difficult decision. Pursuing a full trial carried risks. Without clear-cut, indisputable evidence, there was a possibility, however remote, that a jury might question aspects of the case, and for a situation already surrounded by public scrutiny, the outcome had to be more than persuasive. It had to be secure. So the prosecution offered a plea agreement. Parker agreed to plead guilty to 2 felony charges. In exchange, other charges would not proceed to trial. The court imposed a 60-year sentence on the most serious charge and 16 years on the secondary, served concurrently. This ensured Parker would be incarcerated for the majority of his adult life. In court, Judge Lori Thatcher Quillen addressed the decision directly. She acknowledged that many members of the public had hoped for a trial and a harsher sentence, but she emphasized the importance of ensuring a conviction that would stand without appeal. The evidence, while strong, was not infallible, and in cases like this, the goal was not to gamble, it was to guarantee. The judge underscored that the agreement was the best course of action to ensure Parker would be removed from society for decades to come. Following sentencing, Parker was transferred to the Indiana State Prison. His earliest possible parole eligibility is listed as the year 2061.
How old is your daughter? 10. Oh, yeah, she's 10.
Nothing is beyond anyone's conception that this could happen, especially to a little 10-year-old child.
Involved in the criminal law for over 30 years, and this is the most inhumane case I think I've come across.
We're her voice, and we gotta speak up.
If nobody's gonna do it, we have to do it.
Victoria Martins was just 10 years old, a bright, cheerful little girl who loved gymnastics and the color purple. Her life was filled with curiosity and joy, but in one unimaginable night, everything changed. The story that would unfold left an entire community shattered and searching for answers. This is a case that broke the heart of an entire community and left unanswered questions lingering in its wake. What really happened behind those closed doors? How did a little girl with so much love and innocence become the center of one of the most haunting tragedies in recent memory? To understand the unimaginable, we must go back and piece together the story, one that shocked the nation and revealed the darkest corners of human nature. Stay with us as we dive into the unsettling case of Victoria Martins, a story of betrayal, deception, and the fight for justice. Before we begin, a viewer discretion warning. This documentary will examine neglect and systemic failures in child welfare case. While we present the facts carefully, some details may still be difficult for certain viewers. And if you're new to this channel, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And to all my loyal subscribers, thank you for your continued support and donations. Your engagement and shares means the world and helps us share these important stories. If you find it important to discuss cases like this and give a voice to victims who can no longer speak for themselves, please consider subscribing. Your support helps us keep raising awareness and ensures that no story is forgotten. Now, Let's get back to the story. Victoria Martins was born on August 23, 2006 in Albuquerque, New Mexico. From the beginning, her life was marked by challenges, but despite the hardships, she remained a bright, cheerful child with a spirit that seemed unbreakable. Victoria loved gymnastics, swimming, and the color purple. She was known for her infectious smile and playful energy, lighting up every room she entered. Raised by her single mother, Michelle Martins, Victoria's early life was shaped by her mother's struggles. Michelle faced the daunting task of raising 2 children alone after Victoria's father abandoned them at birth. The father's absence left Michelle to balance the demands of parenthood with the relentless pressure of providing for her family. As a result, she often leaned on her parents, John and Pat Martins, who played a significant role in Victoria's upbringing. They were her unwavering support system, and to them, Victoria was their little queen. They cherished every moment they spent with her, nurturing her passion for gymnastics and encouraging her to embrace life with joy. As Victoria grew older, her world remained filled with innocence and wonder. She thrived in school and loved spending time at the park, roller skating, and practicing her gymnastics routines. Her teachers described her as polite, friendly, and full of life, a little girl who cherished the simple joys of childhood. Victoria's grandparents remained a steady presence, always ready to support and protect her whenever they could. For Michelle, being a single mother was not only financially demanding but emotionally exhausting. Balancing work and childcare became a daily challenge, and she often found herself overwhelmed and longing for companionship. In search of support and a sense of stability, Michelle turned to online dating. It was there that she met Jason Ng, a man who seemed to offer the stability she desperately sought. Jason quickly became part of their lives, and to Victoria he represented the father figure she never had. He was kind to her, and for a while it seemed like their small family had found a semblance of normalcy. In 2008, Michelle and Jason welcomed a baby boy named Matthew, Victoria's half-brother. The birth brought a renewed sense of hope for Michelle and her children. Victoria, just a toddler at the time, embraced her new role as a big sister with excitement. She adored Matthew, and their bond became one of the few constants in her life. Together they made memories that would later stand in stark contrast to the nightmare that awaited them. Despite the hope that Jason brought to their lives, the relationship did not last. In the following years, Michelle's romantic life became increasingly tumultuous. She cycled through a series of relationships, each one more fleeting than the last. Desperation for companionship and stability led her back to online dating, a choice that would ultimately change the course of Victoria's life forever. On several occasions between 2015 and 2016, Michelle herself made multiple calls to the New Mexico Children, Youth and Families Department, CYFD, seeking assistance and intervention. In total, CYFD received 5 phone calls regarding the Martins household, many of which were initiated by Michelle in an attempt to ensure safety and well-being. One particularly concerning report came in March 2016, when Michelle expressed fear that one of her boyfriends had acted inappropriately towards Victoria. This alarming call should have prompted an immediate and thorough investigation, yet despite the gravity of the situation, CYFD's response was minimal at best. The agency failed to conduct a comprehensive assessment or follow up with any meaningful intervention, leaving the situation unresolved. These red flags were clear indications that something was amiss, but no concrete action was taken to evaluate the household or ensure that Victoria was in a safe environment. The lack of decisive response from CYFD created a critical gap in support, leaving the family vulnerable despite Michelle's attempts to seek help. It was a significant oversight that would later be recognized as a major failing of the system. In hindsight, it's hard to understand how these warning signs went unaddressed. The absence of follow-up and failure to investigate would later become a focal point of public outcry, with the community demanding accountability from an agency tasked with safeguarding families. Many questioned how such crucial alerts could be overlooked, allowing the situation to continue unchecked. As the years went by, Michelle's life was unraveling. Each failed relationship left her more vulnerable, and she began making reckless decisions that would expose Victoria to unimaginable danger. Online dating became her escape, and with each new connection, she grew more disconnected from reality. What she didn't realize was that one of these fleeting relationships would soon shatter their world completely. In the months leading up to Victoria's passing, Michelle met Fabian Gonzalez through an online dating platform. He presented himself as charming and attentive, quickly integrating himself into their lives. But Fabian was far from the supportive partner Michelle had hoped for. Unbeknownst to her, his criminal past and questionable associations would soon set off a chain of events that would lead to unthinkable consequences. It was during this period that Michelle also welcomed Jessica Kelly into their lives, Gonzalez's cousin and a recent parolee. Jessica had just been released from prison and was looking for a place to stay. Unaware of the danger she was inviting into her home, Michelle allowed Jessica to move in, hoping that having more adults around would make things easier. This decision would mark the beginning of a descent into darkness, one that would ultimately claim Victoria's life. As strangers became fixtures in their home, Victoria remained blissfully unaware of the lurking threat. For her, life was still filled with dreams of gymnastics and family outings, unaware of the danger that was inching closer with each passing day. Victoria's life, though filled with love from her grandparents and moments of innocence and joy, was overshadowed by the choices of the adults around her, choices that would ultimately fail to protect her from the horrors that lay ahead. On the night of August 23, 2016, just one day after Victoria Martins celebrated her 10th birthday, the Albuquerque Police Department received a call that would become one of the most harrowing cases they had ever encountered. Emergency responders rushed to the Martins' apartment on the west side of the city. What they found inside would leave even seasoned detectives shaken to their core. The atmosphere was thick with an overwhelming sense of chaos and disbelief. Officers and paramedics tried to make sense of what they were seeing, their training barely enough to brace them for the horrific reality that had unfolded within those walls. Inside the small apartment, they discovered the remains of Victoria Martins. There were clear signs that something bad had taken place, and the circumstances surrounding her passing were almost incomprehensible. The sheer gravity of what had happened shocked even the most experienced investigators, who later described it as one of the most disturbing scenes they had ever witnessed. As officers secured the area, they quickly identified 3 adults at the scene: Michelle Martins, Fabian Gonzalez, and Jessica Kelly. All 3 appeared visibly distressed, but their explanations and accounts were chaotic and contradictory. Detectives attempted to piece together what had occurred, but their initial statements made little sense. The confusion only deepened as each suspect seemed to shift blame, offering fragmented stories that raised more questions than answers. Michelle, the mother of the victim, appeared strangely detached. Despite the severity of the situation, her statements were inconsistent, filled with unsettling details that didn't seem to align with the evidence. Fabian Gonzalez, Michelle's boyfriend, gave his own conflicting version of events, and Jessica Kelly, his cousin, seemed incoherent, offering little clarity to the unfolding investigation. Word of what happened spread rapidly through the neighborhood. Families gathered on sidewalks, watching in stunned silence as the police worked late into the night, combing the scene for evidence. It wasn't long before news cameras arrived, capturing images of the chaotic aftermath and the sheer magnitude of the police presence. The community was in shock. Victoria Martins was a familiar face to many in the area. a bright little girl who loved to play outside, her laughter echoing through the apartment complex. To imagine that something like this could happen to a child, especially one so full of life and potential, left residents reeling with grief and anger. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Vigils were planned within hours as people struggled to process what had taken place. Messages of condolences poured in from across the city, and makeshift memorials appeared outside the apartment complex. Flowers, stuffed animals, and handwritten notes expressing sorrow and disbelief. The authorities were under immense pressure to find answers. How could something like this happen to a young girl in her own home? Who was responsible, and why did it seem that none of the adults present could provide a coherent account of the events? As detectives continued their work, they knew that unraveling the truth would not be easy. The initial chaos and conflicting statements only complicated their efforts, but one fact remained undeniable. The crime was unimaginably brutal, and the community was demanding justice for Victoria. What had happened within the walls of that small apartment? How had a night meant to be filled with the joy of a young girl's birthday turned into a tragedy that would scar a community forever? The search for answers had only just begun. In the days that followed, the focus shifted from processing the shock to demanding accountability. Community members gathered outside the police station, holding candles and calling for justice. The media covered the story relentlessly, digging into every detail and speculating on how such a heartbreaking event could take place right in the heart of a close-knit community. The police knew they were racing against time. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every forensic result needed to be scrutinized carefully. They couldn't afford to overlook a single detail. As the investigation intensified, the public's demand for answers only grew louder, and the case of Victoria Martins became a nationwide talking point. The investigation began without hesitation. Detectives knew that every moment was crucial in piecing together the truth. As they sifted through the chaotic and confusing initial statements from Michelle Martins, Fabian Gonzalez, and Jessica Kelly, it became clear that nothing about this case would be straightforward. Law enforcement meticulously secured the crime scene, ensuring that every possible piece of evidence was collected. Forensic specialists moved cautiously through the apartment, documenting and analyzing each item. The first critical step was processing the physical evidence, including gathering DNA samples from various areas. Detectives knew that forensic results could hold the key to unlocking the truth amid the conflicting statements. The forensic analysis soon revealed a puzzling discovery. Among the collected DNA samples, one stood out: an unidentified male's DNA. This was both unexpected and alarming, as it did not match any of the three suspects present at the scene: Michelle, Fabian, or Jessica. The presence of a fourth individual raised disturbing questions. Who was this unknown person, and how did his DNA end up there? Authorities urgently cross-checked the DNA against both state and national databases, hoping for a match. Yet, despite exhaustive searches, the identity of this individual remained elusive. Investigators knew they were dealing with more than just conflicting testimonies. There was now an entirely new element to the case that demanded answers. Amid the forensic examination, detectives turned their attention to the three suspects. They needed to break down the statements given by Michelle Martins, Fabian Gonzalez, and Jessica Kelly. In the interrogation room, Michelle's demeanor was perplexing. Her initial confessions were not only inconsistent, but also deeply troubling. She admitted to allowing harm to come to her daughter, but the details seemed almost rehearsed and lacked coherence. As investigators pressed for clarity, Michelle's story continued to shift, raising doubts about the credibility of her statements. Detectives noted that Michelle appeared unusually calm and detached. Her accounts were chaotic, weaving in and out of scenarios that seemed implausible and disconnected from reality. One investigator later commented that Michelle seemed to be saying whatever she thought the police wanted to hear, as if she were crafting a narrative on the spot. It left detectives questioning whether she fully comprehended the gravity of what she was saying, or whether someone had influenced her version of events. Detectives then moved on to questioning Fabian Gonzalez. His attitude was defensive, and he firmly denied any involvement in what had happened to Victoria. Fabian claimed he had been asleep and had no knowledge of any wrongdoing, yet his story also lacked consistency. Investigators noticed gaps in his timeline and contradictions in his description of the night's events. Despite his assertions of innocence, detectives were not convinced. Jessica Kelly, meanwhile, proved even more challenging to interrogate. Having recently been released from prison, Jessica was visibly agitated and often incoherent. She maintained that an unknown man had entered the apartment and committed the crime while she was incapacitated. Her claim was not only unsupported, but also contradicted by the evidence found at the scene. Detectives quickly identified her account as unreliable, but the chaos of her story only made the investigation more complex. Detectives were determined to cross-reference every statement with tangible evidence. They examined phone records from the night of the crime, looking for any indications of calls or messages that might explain the presence of an unidentified male. What they found did not align with the stories provided by the suspects. Michelle had mentioned allowing people into her home, but records did not support her claims. Surveillance footage from nearby cameras revealed movements around the apartment building, but nothing definitively linked anyone else to the crime. Adding to the complexity were the criminal backgrounds of both Jessica Kelly and Fabian Gonzalez. Jessica had a history of drug charges and had only recently been paroled. Fabian, too, had a record involving criminal behavior, raising suspicions about his influence on Michelle and his potential role in the crime. Yet, despite their criminal pasts, nothing directly linked either of them to the act itself. The forensic evidence, especially the DNA from an unknown male, remained a troubling mystery. Public reaction to the unfolding investigation was intense and unrelenting. As news of Michelle's confessions spread, people were horrified and outraged. The idea that a mother could be involved in such a situation was incomprehensible to many. The media followed every development closely, and public forums erupted with debates over guilt, blame, and justice. Community members gathered at vigils, demanding answers and holding signs that called for accountability. Despite the pressure from both the community and the media, detectives remained focused on unraveling the truth. As more forensic results came in, they scrutinized every detail, hoping to find something that would break the case open. Yet the conflicting stories, the presence of unidentified DNA, and the complicated personal histories of the suspects made it nearly impossible to pinpoint a clear narrative. Michelle's claims about using substances to incapacitate her daughter were scrutinized carefully. Toxicology reports, however, revealed no substances in Victoria's system. This finding directly contradicted Michelle's initial statements, casting further doubt on her credibility. Detectives began to consider whether her confession was coerced or influenced by others. The public reaction to this new revelation was swift. Many began questioning whether Michelle had been manipulated into giving false statements. Some speculated that pressure from the interrogators might have caused her to fabricate stories, while others pointed to her apparent lack of awareness as a sign of coercion. The lack of physical evidence to support her claims became a focal point of public discourse. As the investigation continued, the growing tension between public perception and the unfolding truth created an atmosphere of intense scrutiny. Detectives knew that solving this case would require more than just confessions. It would take irrefutable evidence and a thorough examination of every lead. With public sentiment growing more intense by the day, investigators faced mounting pressure to provide answers, while the haunting question remained: who did the unknown DNA belong to, and what role did it play in this event? With each new piece of evidence, the investigation seemed to grow more complex rather than clearer. The community's demand for justice grew louder, while detectives worked tirelessly to find the real answers in a case that had already shocked the nation. What seemed certain was that the truth lay buried beneath layers of deceit and confusion, and it would take every effort to uncover the reality behind Victoria's fate. The courtroom proceedings that followed the arrests of Michelle Martins, Fabian Gonzalez, and Jessica Kelly drew intense public attention. As the case moved forward, the community remained on edge, waiting for justice to be served. The pressure on the prosecution was immense, and the weight of public expectation was undeniable. From the very start, the prosecution faced challenges. Michelle Martins had given numerous statements, many of which were inconsistent and contradictory. Detectives had invested countless hours trying to separate fact from fiction, but the confusing nature of her confessions made it difficult to create a coherent narrative. The prosecution knew they had to tread carefully, as the defense would undoubtedly exploit any inconsistencies. Jessica Kelly was the first to take a plea deal. Realizing that the evidence against her was substantial, she chose to admit to tampering with evidence and other related charges. In exchange for her cooperation and a guilty plea, she avoided a more severe sentence. Jessica was sentenced to 50 years in prison. This decision sparked significant outrage within the community, as many felt the punishment did not truly reflect the gravity of her involvement. People demanded stricter consequences, feeling that justice had not been fully served. Fabian Gonzalez was next. He faced charges related to creating a dangerous environment and obstructing evidence. Initially, prosecutors sought harsher penalties, but as evidence became more convoluted, some of the charges were dropped. The prosecution argued that Fabian's actions contributed to an environment where harm could occur, emphasizing his connection to Jessica Kelly and his failure to protect Victoria. Despite his defense team's efforts to minimize his involvement, the court ultimately sentenced him to 37 years in prison. Public reaction to Fabian's sentence was deeply divided. Some believed the punishment was appropriate given the charges, while others felt that dropping the most serious accusations left too many questions unanswered. There was a widespread sense that the full story had not been revealed, and many felt that the justice system had failed to hold everyone accountable. The most controversial outcome came with the sentencing of Michelle Martins. After prolonged negotiations, Michelle accepted a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to reckless endangerment resulting in severe consequences, a decision that shocked many who had followed the case from the beginning. As part of the agreement, she was sentenced to 12 years in prison. The community's response was swift and unforgiving. Demonstrations erupted outside the courthouse, and social media was flooded with messages of disbelief and frustration. Many questioned how a mother who had failed to protect her child could receive such a light sentence. Defense attorneys argued that Michelle had been manipulated and coerced, but that reasoning did little to quell the public outrage. The controversy reached new heights when in 2022 it was announced that Fabian Gonzalez was released on his own recognizance ahead of his trial. This development ignited a fresh wave of anger and disbelief, as many saw it as a fundamental failure of the justice system. Community members demanded answers, questioning how someone linked to such a deeply troubling case could be released. Advocacy groups called for stricter policies to prevent similar situations in the future. Legal experts and analysts debated the decisions, acknowledging that the prosecution faced significant challenges due to conflicting confessions and limited direct evidence. Some argued that the plea deals were a practical solution, given the complexity of the case. Others, however, remained steadfast in their belief that true justice had not been achieved. In the aftermath of the sentencing, community leaders and activists organized vigils and rallies to honor Victoria. They called for reforms in child protection protocols and demanded that those in positions of power do more to safeguard vulnerable children. Candlelight vigils continued to mark the anniversary of her passing, reminding the community that her story would not be forgotten. Local lawmakers took notice, proposing new legislation designed to strengthen oversight and accountability in cases involving at-risk children. Community members pushed for policies that would close loopholes and ensure that protective services were more proactive in identifying and addressing signs of danger. The collective grief of the city was channeled into advocacy and reform, determined to prevent future tragedies. For many in Albuquerque, this case became a symbol of systemic failure. It revealed deep flaws in how protective agencies and legal processes handled vulnerable families and children. The public remained vigilant, holding those in power accountable and pushing for changes to prevent such a situation from ever happening again.
He looked up at me and he wasn't limp or nothing, when I picked him up, you know what I'm saying? He was still kind of squirmy, but he didn't have a full fight.
He was only 2 years old, too young to understand betrayal, but not too young to feel it. What happened to him wasn't just a tragedy. It was a failure on multiple levels. A failure to protect, a failure to intervene, and ultimately, a failure that cost him his life. When authorities arrived, the story they were told didn't line up with what they saw. The explanation was simple, too simple, but the questions kept piling up. Why had no one spoken up sooner? Why had so many red flags been ignored? This was more than a single moment of violence. It was the final chapter in a pattern that had been quietly unfolding for weeks. A little boy was caught in the middle of something he couldn't understand, and by the time the truth came out, it was far too late. And the person responsible? He didn't seem worried at all. Before we go any further, please note that today's case involves the passing of a child and circumstances that may be upsetting to some viewers. We will present the facts responsibly and avoid graphic content, but viewer discretion is still advised. If you're new here, welcome. Let us know where you're watching from in the comments. This is a space for people who believe these stories matter. And to our current subscribers, supporters, and everyone who's liked, commented, or shared our videos, thank you. Your support doesn't just grow the channel, it helps bring attention to cases that deserve to be remembered. You're helping give a voice to those who no longer have one, and we're incredibly grateful you're here. Now, let's get back to the story of Aiden Batista. Aiden Batista was born on May 2, 2008 in Palm Bay, Florida. He was the only son of Whitney Flowers and Jeffrey Batista. Not long after his birth, Whitney and Jeffrey separated, but both remained active in their roles as parents. Their custody arrangement was informal yet stable. Aiden spent most of his weekdays with his mother and many weekends and evenings with his father and paternal grandparents. Those who knew Aiden described him as bright and observant, full of energy and eager to explore the world around him. His presence was memorable even at such a young age. He had routines, familiar places, and people who deeply cared for him. His father, Jeffrey, was known to be reliable and consistent. When Aiden stayed with him, there was structure, meal times, play, and quiet nights at home. His paternal grandparents also played a significant role. They helped with caregiving during the week and often provided support whenever Jeffrey needed it. On the other side of town, Whitney was managing the demands of full-time work in healthcare. Employed as a medical assistant or nurse, she was often required to work long hours, including late-night shifts. With limited outside help and no formal daycare in place, She began leaning more on those within her immediate circle for support. Initially, this included trusted friends and neighbors, but that changed in the final months of 2009 when Jason Padgett entered her life. Whitney and Jason met through mutual acquaintances. The relationship developed quickly. Within just a few weeks, Jason was spending more and more time at Whitney's apartment. By the end of the year, he had moved in. To outsiders, the decision appeared rushed, especially given Jason's background. But Whitney seemed determined to build something stable, something new, and Jason became part of that vision. Jason Padgett's past, however, raised immediate concerns. He had a long record of offenses stretching back several years. His background included incidents involving theft, confrontation with law enforcement, and prior arrests related to violence. At the time he moved in, he had only recently been released from custody. Despite this, he quickly became a central figure in Aiden's daily routine. With Whitney often away at work, Jason was left to care for Aiden for long stretches of time. What had once been a balanced custody arrangement slowly shifted. Aiden began spending fewer days with his grandparents and more time in Whitney's apartment, often under Jason's supervision. Family members on Jeffrey's side later expressed concern. They noticed a shift in how often they saw Aiden. Some said his behavior had changed. Others pointed to small moments, missed calls, canceled visits, unexplained delays. Jeffrey himself attempted to revise the informal custody agreement, but without a legal structure in place, there was little he could do. During this time, subtle but important changes were happening behind closed doors, and while no single incident raised alarm high enough to trigger a formal investigation, the pattern was clear in hindsight. The people who once formed Aiden's circle of support were now further away, and the man now closest to him, a man with a documented history of instability, was rarely questioned. By early 2010, the home environment around Aiden had changed significantly. The structure, stability, and oversight he once had were slipping away, and no one, not family, not friends, not neighbors, realized just how critical those missing safeguards would become. Jason Padgett was 28 years old when he became part of the household shared by Whitney Flowers and her young son. The relationship started in the final months of 2009. It progressed quickly. Within just 3 months of meeting, Jason moved into Whitney's apartment and almost overnight became a daily presence in her son's routine. For many, the pace of their relationship was concerning, but those closest to Whitney said she seemed eager for stability, someone who could share responsibilities, help around the home, and fill the gaps left by her demanding work schedule. What few outside the relationship fully understood at the time was the history Jason brought with him. His record was long and complex. Over the years, Jason had faced multiple legal issues. He had been arrested for robbery, had prior drug charges, and had been involved in a number of altercations that resulted in serious legal consequences. His encounters with law enforcement were not isolated or minor. He had been in and out of the system for much of his adult life. At the time he moved in with Whitney, Jason had only recently been released from incarceration. Yet there was no mechanism in place to prevent him from living in a home with a minor. No agency intervened. And with no formal custody arrangement filed with the court, no one reviewed or challenged the change in the household structure. Soon after his arrival, neighbors began to notice disturbances. Loud arguments from the unit became more frequent. Some said they overheard yelling late at night. Others described the energy around the apartment as increasingly tense. Despite these concerns, no formal complaints were submitted. There were no police calls, no welfare checks. Those closest to Whitney also noticed shifts in the home environment. Jason was spending more and more time alone in the apartment, often responsible for day-to-day supervision. Friends who visited the home later described him as impatient, withdrawn, and difficult to engage. One One visitor said he avoided answering questions and grew visibly frustrated during casual conversations. A few neighbors and acquaintances recalled troubling moments. A maintenance worker remembered seeing Jason pacing outside with the child, clearly agitated. A family friend mentioned an instance where the toddler appeared unusually quiet during a short visit. Another neighbor shared that she once observed Jason handling the boy in a way that made her uncomfortable, but admitted she chose not to get involved. All of these accounts were shared after the fact, long after they could have made a difference. In every case, no report was made to local authorities or child services. Whether it was fear, hesitation, or uncertainty about what they were witnessing, the result was the same: silence. By early 2010, Jason Padgett had taken on a central role inside the home. He had full access to Whitney's apartment, control of daily routines, and consistent, unsupervised time with the minor. All without formal scrutiny. His criminal background remained buried in public files. His behavior, though noticed, was never documented in official records, and the people who saw signs didn't speak up, not until it was too late. In the weeks before April 7, 2010, something in the apartment on Waxwing Avenue began to shift. Subtle at first, then harder to ignore. People close to the situation later admitted that they had noticed things, moments that didn't feel right. But without context and without action, those observations faded into silence. Several residents of the apartment complex remembered hearing raised voices coming from inside. The volume and frequency were enough that neighbors recalled it without being asked. A janitor who maintained the building noticed something else. A brief interaction in the hallway, where he saw Jason Padgett with the young boy. When asked about marks around the child's eye, Padgett casually attributed them to a fall, calling him clumsy. A friend of Whitney's visited around the same time. She later described the home as tense. During her visit, she noticed the boy seemed distant. There were faint marks on his arm, and when she asked Jason what happened, his response was defensive. When she continued to question him, she was asked to leave. What's critical is that each of these accounts existed before April 7. All of them were shared later, when it was already too late to intervene. On April 7th, Whitney left for her shift at the hospital at around 3 p.m. Jason remained in the apartment. According to his later statements, the boy had an accident in the bathroom while brushing his teeth. A fall, he said, but no one else was present to confirm the story. He didn't reach out to Whitney, he didn't alert anyone. Instead, he claimed he put the boy in bed, and for the next several hours, Padgett continued about his evening. He reportedly played video games, he texted friends. According to one recipient, he made no mention of anything unusual. No outside contact was made, no medical attention was sought. By the time Whitney returned home, nearly 8 hours had passed. Whitney arrived at the apartment around 11:15 p.m. The lights were dim. Jason told her the boy had gone to sleep early, but when she checked the bedroom, something felt off. Her son wasn't resting. He wasn't responding. She asked Jason what had happened. He repeated the same line. It wasn't serious, just a small fall. But something in his demeanor, she would later say, felt wrong. There was hesitation, there was avoidance. When she realized the situation required urgent care, Whitney acted. She transported her son to Holmes Regional Medical Center. Once there, medical professionals began their evaluations and quickly determined that additional resources were needed. He was transferred to Arnold Palmer Hospital in Orlando for further assessment. At the second facility, the clinical team began piecing together the boy's condition. Their findings raised immediate concern. The account of a minor accident didn't align with what they were seeing. As tests continued, the extent of the medical situation became clearer. On the morning of April 8th, the official status changed. The boy's condition had reached a critical point, and medical intervention could no longer reverse it. Aiden Batista passed away. Healthcare staff contacted law enforcement. A report was filed. An investigation was opened. For the first time, the version of events given to authorities would be placed under scrutiny. The story that had until then remained within the walls of a small apartment would soon be examined under the weight of expert analysis, witness accounts, and forensic review. The investigation was only beginning. The moment medical professionals at Arnold Palmer Hospital reviewed the full extent of Aiden's condition, a chain of internal red flags was triggered. The story they were given, that a young boy had slipped while brushing his teeth, didn't align with the medical profile in front of them. It was clear that the situation required immediate escalation. Hospital staff, following established procedures, referred the case to law enforcement. A forensic review was launched, and a board-certified pathologist was brought in to conduct a comprehensive examination. The findings from the forensic analysis added sharp contrast to the narrative Jason Padgett had given. The injuries observed were not typical of a short fall or isolated accident. Specialists noted patterns that suggested a more complex history, injuries that were varied in appearance and seemed to have occurred over multiple points in time. The report confirmed that several of the medical indicators showed inconsistencies with Padgett's version of events. What stood out even more was that some of the physical signs showed evidence of having existed prior to the day in question. This created a timeline that extended far beyond a single afternoon. The explanation offered: a slip in the bathroom no longer held weight. The medical data provided a different view, one involving repeated incidents, not a one-time misstep. First responders who had been present during the transport also submitted their accounts. They noted Padgett's guarded demeanor, limited communication, and unusual responses during basic questioning. According to their logs, he appeared disconnected from the seriousness of the situation. In contrast, Whitney Flowers had been visibly shaken and overwhelmed, struggling to understand how her son had declined so rapidly. Detectives from the Palm Bay Police Department were assigned to the case immediately. Padgett was brought in for a formal interview the next day. Sitting across from investigators, he initially repeated the same version. The boy had simply fallen. He claimed it was minor, said he seemed fine afterward, and maintained that nothing out of the ordinary had taken place. But investigators had already reviewed the preliminary forensic results. They knew the account wasn't adding up. With each inconsistency, the pressure grew. Detectives methodically broke down the timeline, the gaps in his story, and the discrepancies between his claims and the medical documentation. Eventually, Padgett shifted his position. He admitted to becoming frustrated, describing a moment where he grabbed Aiden by the leg and let go. He said it wasn't intentional, that it was an emotional response, not something planned. But even this revised statement didn't resolve the conflict between what was being said and what had been medically confirmed. The revised version raised even more questions. Investigators challenged him repeatedly. One of the detectives, according to official transcripts, told him directly, "This wasn't from one fall, Jason. We've read the reports. We know that." What emerged in the interview was a pattern of avoidance, partial truths layered with deflection. But by then, the professionals handling the case had built a clear structure around what had taken place. The forensic team had already concluded that the explanation Padgett offered was inconsistent with the condition observed. Outside of the interview room, police had already begun gathering supplemental statements from hospital staff, neighbors, and individuals close to the family. The emerging portrait was consistent. There had been early signs, unspoken concerns, and growing doubts in the weeks leading up to the incident. Taken together, the medical findings, Padgett's conflicting accounts, and the lack of timely action, the case against him was forming. And now, with investigators closing in, attention was shifting toward the next step: formal charges, and a courtroom that would determine what accountability looked like in a case that had shaken an entire community. By mid-2010, the investigation into the events surrounding Aiden Batista had reached a decisive point. The medical evaluations were complete, the forensic evidence reviewed, and statements gathered. After months of building the case piece by piece, law enforcement proceeded with formal charges against Jason Padgett. He was taken into custody and charged with multiple felony counts, including first-degree homicide, endangerment, and criminal neglect. These charges reflected the serious nature of the case not only in terms of what occurred on April 7th, but also the concerns raised about prior warning signs. Padgett remained in custody as pre-trial motions began. His defense team requested extensions and argued for additional evaluations, citing the complexity of the evidence. The official trial date was set for 2012. Inside the courtroom, the tone was measured but heavy. The case had drawn significant public interest. Community members, reporters, and legal observers filled the seats, eager to follow how the proceedings would unfold. The prosecution opened by outlining their core argument, that the evidence told a very different story from what Padgett had initially claimed. Key elements of the state's case included expert testimony from forensic and medical professionals, a timeline supported by hospital records, and witness statements describing prior concerns about Padgett's behavior. One by one, specialists explained why the injuries could not be explained by a minor household incident. Their conclusions pointed to a pattern, not a one-time occurrence. The jury also heard Jason Padgett's recorded interviews. Over time, his explanations had shifted. What began as a claim of an accidental fall had evolved into a more complicated admission that he had responded in frustration during a moment of tension. Prosecutors emphasized the sequence of these statements to show a lack of consistency and a pattern of avoidance rather than accountability. Neighbors and acquaintances also testified. Some described overhearing conflicts inside the apartment. Others recalled seeing unexplained marks or awkward interactions. One witness, the maintenance worker mentioned previously, stated that Padgett dismissed concerns when asked about visible injuries, offering vague explanations that didn't match the circumstances. The defense team focused on a different strategy. They suggested that Whitney Flowers bore partial responsibility, arguing that she had entrusted Padgett with responsibilities he wasn't prepared for. They described the event as a momentary lapse, attempting to frame it as unintentional and out of character. They painted Padgett as overwhelmed, not malicious. But the prosecution pressed back with hard data. They presented a detailed timeline of the day in question, including phone records, witness accounts, and hospital reports. They pointed out that Padgett had delayed seeking help, and that his actions following the incident raised serious questions about his intent and state of mind. The jury deliberated for several hours after closing arguments. In the end, the verdict was clear. Jason Padgett was found guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase followed shortly after. The judge imposed the maximum penalty allowed by law, life in prison with no possibility of parole. According to those present in the courtroom, Padgett remained mostly silent. He showed no visible reaction as the sentence was read aloud. The family sat together in the gallery, holding each other. Adan's grandfather, who had been present at the hospital during the final hours, was seen emotional during the proceedings. Other family members quietly wept as the case drew to a close. For prosecutors, the conviction marked the end of a long, difficult investigation. For the family, it offered some measure of justice, though no verdict could ever fully restore what had been lost. The courtroom emptied slowly that day. Outside, reporters prepared statements. Community members spoke quietly among themselves. And as the door closed behind Jason Padgett, so too did one of the most closely watched cases in Brevard County's recent history. After the sentencing, attention shifted away from the courtroom and toward the institutions that were meant to provide oversight. Behind the headlines and verdicts, a more difficult truth began to surface, one that exposed missed chances and preventable errors. Records later revealed that Brevard County's Department of Children and Families had an active file linked to the household. Concerns had been flagged, a case had been opened, but no decisive action was taken, no in-home evaluation, no follow-up visit. The situation remained in a state of limbo until it was too late to intervene. Just days before the emergency response that changed everything, officers from a local police department had visited the residence. The visit was prompted by a 911 call. Jason Paget provided an explanation at the scene, one that was accepted without further verification, and then the officers left. No official investigation followed, no alert was made to protective services. It was a moment where questions could have been asked and weren't. Outside the agencies, there were also individuals, people who had noticed things, neighbors, friends, visitors. Some had seen changes in the child's behavior. Others had overheard confrontations or witnessed interactions that didn't feel right. In later interviews, several of them admitted they had considered reporting their concerns, but in each case, that call was never made.
Flowers, balloons, and a card saying Forever 5, always in our hearts, baby Kinsley, sit outside the Southwest Side home she was found in. Metro Police say the 5-year-old was unresponsive, thin, with sunken eyes, and had feces on her feet and in her hair. Riley Hospital reports Kinsley was so malnourished, she weighed more at 2.5 years old than at 5.
She was only 5 years old. When authorities stepped into that home on April 9, 2024, they weren't expecting what came next. They had come to check on a newborn child. Instead, they uncovered something far more troubling, something hidden in plain sight. In one of the rooms, they found a door. On the other side was a small, enclosed space where a little girl had been spending most of her life. A space no child should have ever seen, let alone lived in. The air was heavy, the walls were marked. There were signs that this place had been used not just as a room, but as a barrier, cutting a child off from the rest of the world. And behind that door was the truth they could no longer ignore. Her name was Kinsley Welty, and the people responsible for what happened to her weren't strangers. They weren't unknown threats lurking in the shadows. They were the people who should have protected her. Her own mother, Tony McClure, her mother's boyfriend, Ryan Smith, and her maternal grandmother, Tammy Holly. This was not a case of sudden danger. It was a slow, quiet descent, marked by warnings, missed chances, and decisions that allowed it to continue for far too long. The child protection system had been involved, reports had been made, but somehow it still ended here. This documentary follows the timeline of what led to that final day, from early concerns to repeated removals and returns, from relatives who begged for help to institutions that turned away, and from silence to discovery, to the moment a community finally understood what had been happening behind that door. What you're about to watch contains real details from a verified case. While care has been taken to present this with respect and responsibility, the content may be emotionally difficult to process. Viewer discretion is advised. If you're new to the channel, we invite you to subscribe and share where you're watching from. And to our returning viewers, your support helps bring light to stories that deserve to be told. Thank you for helping us keep these voices from being forgotten. Now, let's get back to this case. Kinsley Welty was born on December 3, 2018 in Mooresville, Indiana. In the early years, those who saw her described a child full of energy, laughter, and curiosity. She had bright eyes, a wide smile, and a soft voice that often carried the lyrics of Taylor Swift songs around the house. Her favorite shows were simple ones, colorful, musical, and made for children who still believed the world was a safe place. She didn't have much, but what she had she cherished. Dress-up days, cartoons on the couch, the kind of ordinary moments that most children experience without fear. Her paternal grandparents, Tricia and Brian Welty, remembered those times vividly. To them, Kinsley was not just a child. They saw her as someone they needed to protect. They opened their home to her more than once, hoping it would be permanent. Her biological parents, Tony McClure and Bradley Welty, had a rocky path. The relationship had been marked by instability, but for a brief time it seemed the system had stepped in. In January 2019, when Kinsley was just 3 weeks old, the Indiana Department of Child Services began their first investigation. A wellness call led caseworkers to her family's home in Morgan County. What they found prompted immediate action. The environment was assessed as unsuitable, and both parents were taken into custody for endangering their children's well-being. Tony McClure, Kinsley's mother, was later convicted for endangering a dependent. She served only 21 days before being released on probation. During that time, Kinsley was placed with a foster parent who grew attached to her quickly. The caregiver later shared her hope to adopt the child, but that process was halted. Indiana law, like many states, emphasizes reunification with biological parents, an approach designed to give families a second chance, even when that path may come with risk. Following Tony's release, DCS returned Kinsley to her care. But concerns didn't end there. More reports followed, and Kinsley was again removed, this time placed with her paternal grandparents, Tricia and Brian Welty. They described Kinsley as more active, more expressive, and showing signs of emotional comfort during her time with them. Still, the pattern continued. Kinsley was sent back to her mother once again. Tricia Welty later spoke publicly, stating she should have never been given back to her. The sentiment wasn't hers alone. Other family members and concerned observers had raised red flags. There were documented concerns that were never fully acted upon. With each return, Kinsley was placed back into a situation that had already raised serious questions, and with every decision to reunite, those questions were left unanswered. By early 2023, Kinsley's father, Bradley Welty, was no longer a part of her life. Their connection had faded over time. The relationship between Bradley and Tony McClure had ended years prior, and there was no record of him maintaining active custody or regular visitation. Officials later confirmed he had not seen his daughter in a considerable amount of time. That same year, Tony began living with 27-year-old Ryan Smith. He moved into the household, which soon included 6 children. The environment grew crowded and difficult to manage, according to family members. Despite this, the arrangement was allowed to continue. Relatives began to notice shifts. Kinsley's behavior changed. Her appearance changed. Her grandparents, Tricia and Brian Welty, became increasingly concerned. They reached out to child services and provided what they believed to be evidence that her situation was not improving. They shared photographs and formal complaints, hoping that someone would step in. But no action was taken. Investigators later interviewed Ryan Smith. He told them that he had reservations about how Kinsley was being treated in the home. He said he voiced concerns to Tony but did not contact authorities, explaining that he feared the entire household might be affected. He did not act further. Throughout this time, the household remained under the supervision of individuals already known to state services. Reports had been made, warnings had been issued, and yet the decisions on record continued to favor reunification. This chapter of the timeline reveals a broader pattern, one where professional oversight had weakened and choices were made that prioritized structure over safety. The risks were visible, but the responsibility to respond was deferred. Thanksgiving Day 2023 marked a shift in how Kinsley was treated inside the home. According to court records and documented interviews, Toni McClure began limiting her daughter's access to shared living spaces. Kinsley was moved into a small enclosed room connected to her brother's bedroom. What began as a response to household tension gradually became a long-term arrangement. Over the next 127 days, that room functioned not as a space of rest or recovery, but as a place of restriction. It was sparsely furnished, without proper accommodations for regular use. Statements gathered during the investigation indicated that Kinsley was not included in regular family routine. When meals were served, she was often excluded. Her siblings later said they were told she had been bad, a label used to justify why she wasn't at the table. This behavior became normalized. The other children noticed she was no longer playing with them, no longer visible in the same ways. In private conversations with child services, her brothers described hearing her ask to come out, but no one around her challenged the situation. Ryan Smith, who had moved into the home earlier that year, later admitted to investigators that he understood the situation was wrong. He said he feared that if authorities were called, all the children could be removed from the home. That fear, he claimed, kept him from speaking up. His inaction allowed the situation to continue without outside interference. According to official records, there were no reports, no welfare checks, and no notifications submitted during this period. By the time winter set in, the pattern had become routine. Within the home, the decision to isolate Kinsley had been accepted by the adults and witnessed by the children. It was never reported. It was never reversed. It became part of the household's rhythm, and across 127 days, the opportunity to intervene was missed again. On the afternoon of April 9, 2024, the Indiana Department of Child Services conducted a scheduled visit to the home of Toni McClure. The purpose of the visit was unrelated to Kinsley. It was to follow up on a separate case involving a newborn who had tested positive for a controlled substance. According to official records, the visit was completed without incident, but Kinsley was never seen. When asked about her whereabouts, Toni told the caseworker that Kinsley was staying with relatives. She gave no specific names or address. The explanation was accepted without verification, and the visit concluded. It would be the last opportunity to intervene. Just a few hours later, at approximately 5:15 p.m., a 911 call came from the same home. Toni now claimed that Kinsley had recently returned from staying with her biological father, Bradley Welty, and had suddenly become unwell. Emergency services were dispatched immediately. First responders arrived and located Kinsley inside the home. She was non-responsive. Immediate medical care was administered, and she was transported to Riley Hospital for Children. Despite continued efforts by medical professionals, she did not recover, and she passed away the same day. Medical staff became concerned. There were clear signs that Kinsley's physical state did not align with the story her mother had just given. Her appearance and overall condition raised urgent questions. An autopsy was conducted and found indicators consistent with prolonged nutritional neglect. Kinsley's weight was recorded at 21 pounds, comparable to the average for a child half her age. That same evening, hospital reports were filed. Law enforcement was notified. The timing of the earlier CPS visit just hours before became a critical part of the case timeline. Kinsley had been in the house all along. Authorities now had to determine not just what happened that day, but what had been hidden for weeks and why no one had been able to stop it. When police launched their investigation into Kinsley's final hours, they began by questioning the adults present in the home. Toni McClure was the first to give a statement. Her account pointed elsewhere. She claimed Kinsley had been staying with her biological father, Bradley Welty, for over 2 months and had only just returned to the home that day. Detectives quickly found inconsistencies. Tawny could not provide an address. There were no recent calls, no text messages, no visits, nothing to confirm that Bradley had been involved in Kinsley's care. When investigators reached out to him directly, he confirmed he had not seen his daughter in a long time. With that claim debunked, Tawny revised her statement. She admitted Kinsley had been at home the entire time. She explained that the decision to keep her in a separate space began months earlier and was, in her words, a form of discipline. She acknowledged the setup had continued through the winter and into the spring. Ryan Smith, Tony's boyfriend, was also interviewed. He admitted he was aware of the situation and said he had expressed concern to Tony, but chose not to contact authorities. He acknowledged that he had entered the room only once during that period and that Kinsley rarely left the space. Amy Holly, Tony's mother and Kinsley's grandmother, initially denied any involvement. But when investigators examined Tony's phone, they discovered a series of text messages that changed the direction of the case. Digital records uncovered extended conversations between Tony and Tammy, showing a pattern of planning and coordination. These were not isolated texts, they stretched over several months. In them, Tammy provided advice on how to manage Kinsley's behavior. The tone was harsh and dismissive, painting the child as a burden rather than someone in need of help. The messages also revealed that Tammy had actively worked to shield the situation from Child Protection Services. She warned Tony ahead of scheduled home visits, helping ensure Kinsley wasn't seen by caseworkers. When asked about these exchanges, Tammy confirmed her role in keeping the child's condition hidden. This level of collaboration went beyond neglect. It reflected intentional effort to conceal what was happening. Prosecutors later used these messages to support their position that the choices made inside that home were not made in panic. They were planned, repeated, and executed in silence. The digital trail provided a rare and unfiltered glimpse into the mindset behind the decisions. Trust, when used without accountability, can become dangerous. And in this case, the absence of oversight didn't just allow things to continue, it became part of the problem. All 3 adults, Tony McClure, Ryan Smith, and Tammy Holly, were arrested and charged. Each had knowledge, each had opportunity, but none of them intervened. Following the arrests of Tony McClure, Ryan Smith, and Tammy Holly, prosecutors moved forward with formal charges based on each individual's role in the events leading up to the investigation. The charges were the result of weeks of compiled evidence, testimony, and digital records. Tony McClure faced the most serious accusations. She was formally charged with 3 felony counts: intentional harm under state law, unlawful confinement, and failure to provide proper care and supervision. The Marion County Prosecutor's Office announced that it would seek a sentence of life without parole, citing the extended timeline and deliberate concealment of the situation. She was assigned 2 public defenders, Dina Martin and Cherie Connor. As of now, Tony remains in custody awaiting trial. No sentence has been handed down yet. A jury trial is scheduled to move forward in the coming months. Ryan Smith, who was living in the home during the timeline in question, was charged with 3 counts of neglect and 1 count of unlawful confinement. While the evidence did not indicate he initiated the decisions made, prosecutors emphasized his awareness and his conscious choice not to act. His bond was set at $50,000, 0 cents, which was later posted. He is currently out on bond and awaiting trial. The charges carry significant penalties, though no formal sentence has yet been issued. Tammy Holly, Kinsley's maternal grandmother, was charged with failing to report a known risk to a minor and contributing to an unsafe environment. The case against her was supported by text messages, showing she was aware of how the situation was being handled and that she took steps to help conceal it. She remains under court supervision while her case proceeds. As with the others, sentencing has not yet occurred. Each defendant appeared separately in court for their initial hearings. During these sessions, the charges were formally read, their rights were reviewed, and each entered a preliminary plea of not guilty. Trial dates have been set for late 2025, pending further developments. In court, prosecutors emphasized that this case was not about a single decision, but about a pattern of choices made over time. Each defendant had insight into what was happening. Each had the ability to step forward, and according to the evidence presented, each chose not to. For nearly 5 years, Indiana's Department of Child Services had a case file open with Kinsley's name on it. During that time, the agency was involved in multiple placements and assessments. Reports were filed, family members raised concerns. But despite repeated interventions, the system's default policy remained the same: reunification. According to state records and family accounts, the agency was contacted on several occasions regarding Kinsley's living condition. Her paternal grandparents, Tricia and Brian Welty, submitted requests asking that she stay in their care. They cited concerns about her well-being and expressed doubt that the environment she was being returned to was appropriate. Still, reunification took precedence. This wasn't a case of the system being unaware, it was a matter of institutional design. In Indiana, as in many states, child welfare protocols place strong emphasis on restoring family unity. The goal is to help families overcome challenges and reunite. But sometimes, that approach is applied even when concerns continue to surface. After Kinsley's case reached the public, Indianapolis City County Councilor Josh Bain publicly called for a formal review of the department's handling of her file. He urged lawmakers to look into how reports are weighed, how cases are reevaluated, and whether reunification policies are being used in cases where protective measures might be more appropriate. Several advocacy groups responded, adding their voices to a growing call for policy review. These organizations pointed out that this wasn't just about one child. It reflected a larger issue seen in cases across the country where early signs are acknowledged but follow-up measures fall short. What followed was a renewed push for reform. Lawmakers began discussions about establishing new criteria for high-risk reunifications, including independent oversight and clearer safety benchmarks before children are returned to previous placements.
I didn't know her, but I feel like I am her. We all have little girls in this neighborhood, and we should be protecting our kids. And I just wish I knew her. I wish I could have done something.
So to hear that this happened to a little girl in this beautiful neighborhood was devastating. And honestly, I had a hard time comprehending that that could happen down the street from where I raised my kids.
Missy Mogul knew she was going to die. She was barely 5 years old, and her small body bore quiet signs of what she had endured. The officer who entered the bedroom that morning would later say it was the first time in his career he had to step outside just to breathe. The scene spoke volumes, not through violence, but through silence, and the way her tiny fingers curled inward, as if bracing for something. But what stunned everyone wasn't just the neglect. It was how many adults had known something was wrong, and yet she had been left alone. The surveillance cameras in that house weren't there for security. They were there to document something much darker. Something you wouldn't believe if it hadn't been captured on hours of video. And when investigators began reviewing the footage, even the most experienced among them struggled to watch. You'll hear later how many times this little girl asked for help. But by the time anyone really listened, it was too late to change the outcome. This isn't just a case of parental failure. It's a failure of every system designed to protect children. A child protection network that missed every flashing red light. A justice system that opened the door and handed her back to the people who would end her life. There were signs, there were reports, there were chances to save her, and each one was wasted. Her name was Missy, and this is not just her story, it's a warning. Because if a child can be lost despite being seen, heard, and reported, then no child is truly safe. A gentle but firm warning before we continue. This documentary involves a deeply troubling case of child neglect and systemic failure. While we will present it with care and avoid disturbing imagery, the subject matter may be emotionally difficult for some viewers. To our new viewers, thank you for joining us. Please consider subscribing and letting us know where you're watching from. It truly helps us understand and reach others who care about protecting vulnerable children. To our returning subscribers, those of you who have liked, shared, or commented on our videos, thank you. You are helping bring these untold stories into the light. Melissa Mogul was born on December 31, 2019, in Florida. From the beginning, she was described as bright, expressive, and unusually empathetic for her age. But behind her early smiles was a family dynamic already strained. Her biological mother, Chloe Mogul, was just 17 at the time of Missy's birth. Unprepared for the demands of motherhood, Chloe left the day-to-day parenting to her own parents, Andy and Pepper Mogul, who lived in Wakulla County. They quickly became the child's primary caregivers. For nearly 4 years, Missy was raised in that home. It was her only stable environment. Her grandmother, Pepper, structured her routines. Her grandfather, Andy, prepared her favorite meals. She developed emotional bonds that helped her thrive. But while Missy was settling into childhood, her mother was drifting further away from it. In 2021, Chloe married Daniel Spencer, a man 12 years older with a history of volatility. Friends from Wakulla High School later said Chloe began changing after she met him. Once outgoing and connected to her family, she began isolating. Communication with her parents dropped off. Missy, once seen regularly at her grandparents' home, was now out of sight. Then in January 2024, a family court ruled that Chloe Mogul could formally resume custody of her daughter. It wasn't a case of legal rights being restored after removal, but rather a recognition of biological parental standing. From birth, Chloe had played a limited role in Missy's life, relying on her parents to raise the child. But after marrying Daniel Spencer and moving into a new home, she petitioned for full custody, claiming that her circumstances had stabilized. The court agreed. There was no formal objection filed by the grandparents and no prior legal termination of Chloe's rights. But what wasn't considered during the hearing would later prove critical. At the time of that custody transfer, Chloe's husband, Daniel Spencer, was out on bond from a recent arrest. He had been charged following a law enforcement operation, targeting individuals communicating with minors online. Despite this, the court placed no restrictions, conducted no home safety review, and did not formally evaluate Daniel's background before returning Missy to their care. No additional vetting was done. No follow-up inspections were scheduled. And without warning, Missy was taken from the only consistent environment she'd known and placed in a household already under scrutiny. In July 2024, a call was made to Florida's Child Protection Hotline. The caller reported a troubling claim, one that involved 5-year-old Missy and her stepfather, Daniel Spencer. According to official documents, Missy had spoken about behavior from Daniel that raised serious concerns. She was 5. Her words were simple, but the message was unmistakable. Daniel had a habit of touching Missy inappropriately. The Department of Children and Families launched a formal investigation. Law enforcement in Tallahassee was brought in. A case file was opened. Detectives documented Missy's statements. They made contact with the adults in the home. But within days, the momentum faded. By protocol, a home visit was conducted. Chloe Spencer, Missy's mother, told investigators that Daniel was no longer in contact with Missy. She claimed Missy had been moved to stay temporarily with a relative and assured them that supervision was in place. There were no visible injuries. No witnesses came forward. And Missy, due to her age, was not considered a strong enough source for legal action. The Tallahassee Police Department reviewed the case, but with no corroborating physical evidence, it was determined that the available information could not support charges. The DCF, in turn, closed the file. The report was marked as inconclusive. The case was shelved. But what made the outcome so critical was what it revealed about the structure of the system itself. There was no secondary review, no multi-agency coordination. The statement of a child, regardless of the risk it implied, was not enough to trigger emergency intervention. Daniel remained in the home. The case remained closed, and no monitoring or supervision was put in place. By the morning of May 19, 2025, Missy was quietly brought back to the house she should have never been returned to. At 7:44 a.m. on May 19, 2025, a call was placed to emergency services from a home in the Southwood community of Tallahassee. On the line was Daniel Spencer. Calm but measured, he told the dispatcher that 5-year-old Missy had become unresponsive. His explanation was brief. She had thrown what he called a tantrum, held her breath, and when he returned to check on her, she was no longer moving. He did not mention any fall, injury, or prior medical condition, just a breath-holding spell, followed by silence. According to Daniel, he had left the room intentionally. He said he believed she would calm herself down. When he returned minutes later and found her unresponsive, he claimed to have panicked and immediately called for help. Inside the home, as paramedics arrived, they found another adult already attempting resuscitation. That man was Robert Frabel, a member of the household and Daniel's relative. Frabel was performing CPR on Missy in the living room near the front entrance. Emergency medical technicians quickly took over. Missy was transported to Tallahassee Memorial Healthcare under full medical response protocol. Despite intervention efforts, she was passed away at 8:34 a.m. Police officers from the Tallahassee Police Department were dispatched to the residence as part of the protocol for any case involving an unresponsive child. Upon arrival, officers began documenting the scene. While the initial report described a breath-holding episode, investigators noted that the physical setting of the home did not align with the events as described. No immediate signs of medical emergency were visible in the areas Daniel referenced. Officers took photographs, began initial interviews, and most critically, collected several electronic items, including a digital storage card. That SD card had been used with an in-home recording system. When forensic investigators began reviewing the device, they discovered that a number of video files had been deleted just hours earlier. The deletion appeared intentional, not automatic. The files were time-stamped, and many of them coincided with the hours before the 911 call was made. The deletion attempt raised immediate red flags. Investigators requested expedited digital recovery. Within 24 hours, they began retrieving footage that would completely reframe the investigation. What had started as a call about an unresponsive child now pointed to something else, something far more deliberate. The recordings captured over several weeks provided a view into the private life of the household. The footage showed Missy in her bedroom, alone, isolated, and often in vulnerable positions. In some segments, she appeared to have her arms and legs restricted in ways that raised immediate concern. In others, she was seen lying motionless while objects were placed over her. Investigators flagged these clips as critical to understanding what had happened and why Daniel Spencer's initial account conflicted so sharply with the evidence. The presence of both adults was confirmed in the footage. Daniel Spencer appeared on multiple occasions. In one clip, he adjusted objects near the child's bed. In another, he stood silently over her without engaging or offering any visible care. His demeanor was distant, his actions methodical. Chloe Spencer also appeared in the recovered footage. In one clip, she entered the room while Missy remained curled up on the mattress. In her hand was an object later identified by police as a household shoe. Her posture, her position, and her proximity to the child were documented clearly. Neither adult reported any of this activity during their initial interviews with investigators. Digital analysts examined the footage frame by frame. The content aligned with recordings from the evening prior to the 911 call and the early morning hours of May 19th. Importantly, investigators confirmed the files had been intentionally erased shortly before emergency responders were contacted. The autopsy report, completed days later, added further clarity. Medical staff noted indicators across multiple areas of the body, marks in various stages of healing, signs of prolonged nutritional neglect, and physical impressions consistent with repeated pressure. The medical examiner did not cite a single fatal cause, but concluded that the condition was consistent with sustained harm over a period of time. These findings, taken together, digital, physical, and behavioral, formed a picture that no longer resembled a medical emergency. It resembled a timeline, one that built slowly, silently, and without intervention, until it could no longer be ignored. On May 27, 2025, just over a week after the 911 call, that prompted the initial investigation, formal charges were filed against both Daniel Spencer and Chloe Mogul. The charges came from the state attorney's office in Florida's Second Judicial Circuit, following an evidence-led review involving law enforcement, digital forensic specialists, and prosecutors. Each individual was charged with 4 felony offenses: second-degree murder, aggravated battery involving a minor, gross neglect, and failure to report endangerment. These charges pointed not to a single incident, but to a pattern of risk and oversight that authorities believed had gone unaddressed for far too long. The court ruled that neither Daniel nor Chloe would be released on bond. This decision was especially significant in Daniel Spencer's case. At the time of the incident, he was already under court supervision for a previous conviction stemming from an unrelated online sting. In that case, he had entered a guilty plea in April 2025, but sentencing had not yet occurred. Despite that status, he had remained in the home, a detail that would later draw public scrutiny. State Attorney Jack Campbell held a press briefing the day the charges were announced. He stated that, based on the timeline, had Daniel Spencer been in custody following his earlier conviction, the outcome of the May 19th emergency call might have been different. While careful not to speculate, Campbell's remarks underscored a broader concern. When supervision fails, consequences can follow. Following their arrest, both defendants were placed in separate detention facilities with strict conditions. They were prohibited from contacting one another, from engaging with witnesses, and from having access to minors, including their own children. The court ordered additional reviews before trial proceedings could begin. Chloe Mogul's initial hearing was scheduled for July 9th. Daniel Spencer's case management hearing was set for August 7th. Until those dates, some elements of the case remained sealed to protect sensitive material still under review. What began as a local investigation had now entered the courtroom, where the focus would shift from what had happened to how it was allowed to happen and what the system will do next. In the weeks that followed, the community surrounding Missy Mogul began to respond. What had started as a quiet case in the Southwood area of Tallahassee was no longer confined to courtrooms and legal briefings. It had begun to spread through neighborhoods, schools, and local congregations, places where people were asking the same question: how did this happen? 2 public memorials were held to honor her memory. The first took place at the Southwood Community Center, just a short distance from the home where Missy had lived. Dozens of residents gathered, parents, teachers, neighbors, all wearing pink and purple, her favorite colors. Children drew butterflies in chalk along the sidewalks. Soap bubbles were released into the air. There were no speeches, just quiet reflection. The second event was held at Pioneer Baptist Church in Crawfordville, the town where Missy had spent her early years with her grandparents. Organized by Jasmine Hartsfield, her godmother, and supported by community leaders, the gathering was intended as a tribute, but it quickly became a moment of resolve. A petition was launched in the days after. Its aim was focused: to strengthen review procedures before placing children in homes where adults have prior legal concerns involving minors. The proposal called for more consistent background checks, closer coordination between state agencies, and accountability in custody decisions. Within days, the petition had gathered hundreds of signatures. No official policy changes had been enacted at that point, but multiple agencies began internal reviews. Meetings were scheduled, files were reopened. Behind the scenes, institutions were asking themselves whether the system had done enough, and what would be required to make sure it never failed in the same way again. What happened in this case wasn't a single failure. It was a pattern: missed signs, delayed action, and systems that didn't speak to each other. Missy's story revealed what was missing long before the crisis came, and that makes what happens next even more important. Prevention starts early. It begins with courts that take every concern seriously, with schools trained to notice the subtle signs, and with communities that stay alert, even when nothing looks obviously wrong. There are steps that matter. First, agencies must share what they know. When systems don't connect, risks get lost. This case made that clear. Second, professionals need the tools to understand young voices. A child may not say it perfectly, but they often say enough if someone's listening. Third, caregivers play a key role. Keep records, dates, comments, small details. They all matter when it's time to step forward. Fourth, help kids know who they can trust. Make safety a conversation, not a reaction. And finally, don't wait for a crisis to bring action. Host awareness nights. Encourage parent training. Bring these conversations into schools before the headlines arrive. This case was not simply about what went wrong. It was about multiple points where the safety net was too thin or missing altogether. And unless reforms are made, the risks remain. Missy's life reflected the potential every child carries. Her story can still serve a purpose. It can change how we listen, it can reshape how we act, and it can drive a wider culture of protection before crisis takes root. If you believe stories like this matter, help us share them. Each share could lead someone to speak up and also raise awareness. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Join others committed to building a safer, more responsive system for children everywhere. In memory of Missy, a child whose voice deserves to be heard long after the silence.